And I was laying in my shelter one night and I heard trees coming down, and you're trying to sleep in the midst of a lodgepole stand, and you can hear trees falling. And that was one of the most nerve-wracking, stressful nights that I had out there, because at any minute, you're thinking that a tree could come down.
What is up, everybody? Big day today. I've got Jim to my right, but that's always a big day. But also an even bigger day, and here's why. Across from us virtually right now, we have Clay Hayes, the man, the myth, the legend, the winner, the last man standing of Season 8 of Alone. I just actually wrapped up finishing the last episode. I watched it this morning because I watch online. Mm-hmm. And holy mackerel, Clay, a season of ups and downs, an emotional roller coaster for me personally. I've never been so emotionally invested in a TV show ever. I can't even imagine what it's like for you, having experienced all these things. So yeah, I mean, that's what we're here to talk about.
Cat's out of the bag too. Like, I didn't, spoiler alert, whatever, but I'm on episode 4 still. So
sorry about that, Jim.
But hey, I'm still going to watch. I'm still going to watch.
You should have told me that 5 minutes ago.
No, that's all right. But it'll be great, though, because I'll come in from, the point of view of somebody who hasn't seen the whole season, right? We got to even each other out here.
Exactly. It's all about balance in life. So, Clay, man, once again, congratulations. I mean, so amazingly cool, an amazing accomplishment. And gosh, should we back up? I mean, we've talked with Clay so many times. Should we have Clay introduce himself a little bit, just so people get a little point of reference?
Briefly, and in the context too of like, who are you, and then why did they tell you when they reached out to you for getting you on the show? Did they tell you like, oh yeah, we love your stuff because of this, and how'd that all get started here too?
Yeah. Brief introduction, and then like, how did that first what was that first contact like?
So yeah, Clay Hayes. I don't know, man. It's anybody that wants to know more about me can look up my YouTube channel. I've got basically my life is on YouTube. My life revolves around traditional archery, bow making, bow hunting. It's what I've done for 20 years. Much of that time was just because it was a passion, and then for the last couple of years, it's what I've done, for my living. I make a living, doing YouTube videos, producing content, basically just do all the things that I love to do, and then make videos about that and share it with the world. And it's been amazing. And I think because of that, I kind of got on the radar for some of the folks at the Alone casting, and got in touch with those folks and just kind of went from there. I had talked to casting people before and never really got a good feeling about the show, that they were casting for. Never got a good feeling about the people, really. But when I talked to Quinn, the casting director for the show Alone, she was just she struck me as a very genuine person. And after getting to know her, she's a great, great gal. And so from the very beginning, I had a good feeling about, just the people, the crew that was putting the show together, and, went through a couple of rounds of selection, did some, different interviews and things like that, and ended up getting a spot on the show, and that's awesome. History.
Now, it's been going on for a few seasons now, but if anybody hasn't heard of Alone, what exactly is it?
So Alone is, the basic concept is there's 10 people, 10 participants, and you get to select 10 very basic items. Things like an axe, a pot, a ferro rod, bow and arrow, traditional bow, things like that. No firearms, no tents, no anything like that. So they take these 10 people with their 10 items, and they drop you off in the middle of nowhere in a very remote wilderness setting. And you have a case full of camera gear, and you film your entire journey as you try to make a living in that place. You have no food. You have to do you have to provide your own food from the land. You have to build your own shelter. And it's basically the last person standing wins $500,000.
Right on. That's pretty awesome. I like the premise of it. And that's what you got to be a part of. Man, there's so many curiosities even just about the behind the scenes of how they even run something like that. And
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Clay, how many days total were you out there?
Well, they dropped me off in middle of September, and it was the end of November when I came out. So I was in there for 74 days. But before that, I was gone from home for a lot longer than that because we had the COVID quarantine and we had boot camp. So, I left my house around the middle of August. So I was gone from home for quite a while.
Wow. You're gone that long. Now I'm already trying to peel back the layers too. Look behind the camera. When they drop you in there with a case full of camera gear, they give you 74 days worth of batteries or what? Is there ever like somebody coming by to just be like, hey, here's some batteries? No, I can't bring you anything else. Like, sayonara.
Yeah, so that's a pretty common question. So periodically they'll come out and do med checks. So they want to come out, they'll take your vitals, they'll weigh you, make sure you're not, make sure you're still fit to continue. And sometimes, and it happened a couple of times this season, people get to the point where their body's so depleted that they have to pull people, for medical reasons. And so they come out periodically and check on you. And so when they do that, they'll bring fresh batteries and freshen up all that stuff.
Got it. All right. Makes sense.
When they did drop you off, like when you've done kind of all this pre-work and the boot camp, and then they drop you off, describe that moment when you're like, oh man, this just got real. Like I'm out here and I'm alone.
Yeah. So there's actually a term that one of the previous participants coined called drop shock, when they drop you off and like the reality of your situation kind of sinks in. And I never really experienced that because it's something, being dropped off or being alone in remote areas is something that I'm very used to. And so it just felt normal for me. It felt like a normal hunt, like any other. What was kind of strange about it though was like for the first 2 or 3 days though, it was very surreal. Like, I had watched all of the episodes from all of the seasons, and to have that realization that now I'm the guy. Like, I'm the guy that's going to be on TV that everybody's watching. That was that was surreal for me, and it took several days for that to wear off.
Yeah. I mean, you do YouTube and stuff already, and for the most part, you're doing YouTube on a level where you're setting up a camera yourself, and you're kind of doing a lot of self-filming already. But, and then thousands of people are watching it. But I still feel like when we shoot videos here, I mean, for example, we got MC Ryan over there, we got lights, we got camera, like we know, it just feels normal that, yeah, a lot of people are going to be seeing this. We're talking to a lot of people, but I don't know. It'd be weird for me out there trying to like self-film something. You're like, no, this is a TV show. There's no director standing right there. There's no one with makeup. It's just, you're out there. But yeah, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people are watching you.
There's that. And then also we've hunted with cameras a handful of times, Jim. And like, it's a pain in the ass when somebody else is doing all that work for you, and even just to be like successful in the field when you have all your normal gear and even a modern firearm or whatever, what have you. I mean, Clay, like what layer of complexity did that add to the experience for you?
Well, for me, it was, again, it just felt normal because that's what I do, all the time. It just kind of, I fell right into it. I'm used to carrying cameras. I'm used to filming everything. And so that's, for me, that was just part of it. Yeah.
It looked natural. on the scenes where you're on there, it looked. I was just kind of felt like I was watching your regular YouTube videos, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, it's like, oh, Clay's doing his thing again.
That's why they got you. What was that boot camp thing that you brought up though? I didn't see anything about that. I'm not up to speed on what that was.
So before they launch everybody, there's like an orientation type period, and you basically just go over the rules and make sure everybody's on the same page with all that stuff. And then they kick you out into the field.
All right, right on. Yeah.
Then you leave the nest.
You good? Yeah. All right. See ya.
In the very beginning, couple first episodes, I mean, you shoot that grouse with your bow, you catch that fish, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Clay is not surviving; he is thriving.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, is that how it felt to you? Were you like, oh man, I'm off to a rockin' start, or were you like, oh man, I'm already hungry?
That's the power of editing. No, I was hungry. It's one of the things. I'm working on a book about the whole experience. Actually, it's at the editors right now. I'm waiting on it to come back. But one of the things that I'd written about in there is when I first got dropped off. That day that they dropped us off, they gave us a giant burrito. And so I'd eaten this big thing. And so when I got dropped off, I was walking around. I was like, man, like I could stay here for 100 days, no problem. But I still had that burrito in my belly. So it was, thoughts like that come easy, when you still have food in your belly. But that, probably the first, I don't know, 5 days I was in there, I'd ate, a grouse and a couple of handfuls of fireweed greens, which by that time, fireweed greens are actually not bad if you get them in the spring, but in the fall, they're, not very good. They're pretty tough. And so, you can imagine that's like half a day's worth of food stretched out over 5 days. But I made the fishing pole. I was able to catch, I actually caught a couple of fish during that first week. They didn't show everything. And so, but even then, 3 or 4 trout that are 20 inches long, spread out over 3 weeks. I was eating one smoked fish fillet a day and a couple of handfuls of fireweed greens and some mushrooms, and that's it's not a lot of calories to keep you going. So yeah, I was very hungry and losing weight rapidly at that time.
Really?
Wow. What's the process of like smoking a fish in the field to preserve it? Like, do you just kind of up high over the fire and let the smoke get to it, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So when I caught the fish initially, all I did was I piled up some rocks in kind of like a chimney formation and made a rack of green alder and just laid the fish fillets out there and then smoked that for a couple hours over an alder fire and basically just tried to dry those fillets down, smoke them to preserve them so that they would keep. And basically that's it. I had no salt, nothing, basically besides the smoke. And the temperatures at that time, it was still, around mid 30s, 40 degrees, and fairly dry, but we had some wet weather at that time as well.
Mm-hmm. With those fish, I guess, smoked like that, like what's your comfort level of like how long that's going to preserve it for?
I mean, I dried them down. I smoked them pretty good. So I didn't feel like they were at risk of, going bad or anything. I think I could have kept them for, months by the time I got done with it. But I wasn't catching that many fish, so I didn't have that problem.
You didn't have to preserve them for too awful long. Were you eating the whole fish? I mean, fins, bones, everything, or?
Yeah, no, I wasn't eating the bones, but I was eating the eyeballs, the brain, the head is really, there's a lot of good fat in the brains, and fat out there is something that you really, like, you take advantage of every possible scrap that you can out there.
Yeah.
And so like the heads and the backbones I'd put in my pot and I'd stew those down and make like a fish head chowder type stuff with the mushrooms. And then also I had some high bush cranberries out there, which went really well with it.
You're describing
good.
something that actually sounds not that bad.
Oh yeah, the cranberries, they pair very well with the smoked trout, Jim.
Right. Yeah, you got to keep yourself. Nothing says you can't eat well when you're out there. Now we're talking about the fish, Mark, but I mean, you got catching the fish. We're already talking about smoking it, but catching it was quite an impressive sight to see. Your method of catching the fish. I mean, you basically made yourself a full-on fishing rod and reel combo like that. I would have bought it at Cabela's. Like it wasn't just a stick with a string on it. I mean, we gotta make that clear. If you didn't see it, it's almost worth just watching the whole thing just to see all the crazy stuff that Clay came up with. And that was arguably, now like I said, I'm not all the way through. Maybe he came up with something crazier, but that was when I saw that.
No, that was
blown away.
I mean, that was cool. That was like Jim said, that wasn't your regular just bring a spool of line or I mean, is that something you had done before, or did you make that up on the spot? I mean, it was very intricate.
Yeah, it was something I had built. I built one of those before going on the show. It was part of my plan from the start. And when I first thought that there was a decent chance that I was going to get on the show, I basically treated that like it was my job to prepare for the show. And so I practiced a lot of those skills. I built that rod. I learned to make nets. I started gaining weight. I mean, I treated it like it was my job to do that. And so, I knew that I didn't want to hand line everything, because casting with a hand line is not the most efficient. You can't really cast that far. And so I knew I needed a rod and reel, and actually found a couple of tutorials online about how to make that rod. So that's not my design. Somebody else came up with that. I just built one while I was out there, which enabled me to cast the lure. I ended up finding a single bottle cap, an old bottle cap where I was, and that's what I caught the majority of my fish on, was that little bottle cap lure that I made with so it was the bottle cap, a piece of snare wire, and then a piece of paracord for a skirt. And it cast just far enough with that rod and reel to catch those fish.
That's so cool.
I mean, yeah, it seemed like you had a shallow area there, and then just a little bit of a drop off. Is that where those fish were? You'd get them was right at that transition there.
Yeah, it was a very tough area to fish. There wasn't a lot of fish, and then as you saw with a lot of the folks that were on the show, the shorelines were just shallow. There was 2 places on my entire site where I could cast to more than 8 feet of water. And so it took me a little while to find those areas, but once I found them, I was able to catch a few fish. Mm-hmm. I tried, for the whole first 5 days or so, I tried to fish pretty much right out in front of my camp, and it was, 40, 50 yards out, it was still 6 feet of water. So there was nothing in that shallow stuff.
I speculate you guys had some downtime. I think a lot of what we talk about today is going to be food related, because I think that was probably, it's kind of the point. Or one of the major points of the show. What were your downtime thoughts about food? Did you have to block them out? Oh man, I can't stop thinking about a cheeseburger right now, or having a pizza, or were you able to focus that and be like, well, I know I need food, but instead of wishing I had a cheeseburger, just planning, how am I going to get that next food, or am I going to fish tomorrow, or am I going to forage tomorrow, am I going to go hunt deer? What did your downtime look like, and was that hard to push some of those thoughts out? Yeah, and did you have imaginations of French fries playing football with cheeseburgers in the stand? They all grew eyes and mouths and started talking to you?
A lot of folks on the show, they like to the editors like to put that stuff in there. I never really had that. I never thought a lot about food other than what I need to do to find more of it. I didn't think about a ribeye steak or cheeseburger, any of that stuff. But one of the biggest challenges, one of the hardest things for me was, so it was probably mid-November. It started getting cold. We started getting a bunch of snow, and I hadn't seen any grizzly tracks for quite a while. I hadn't seen any bears, so I figured the bears were hibernating. So I took all of my remaining jerky, all the remaining meat that I had from the deer that I'd killed, and brought it. It was all hanging in a tree in a bear hang, up until that point. And I brought all that stuff in my shelter. And so it was hanging from the ridge pole of my shelter. And, it was like right in my face every single day. And I had rationed that out so that I was only eating a very small, like maybe 3-4 ounces of jerky a day.
Oh, wow.
And so, you every time you walk into your shelter, it's like you have this bundle of food is sitting right in your face. And it was that, not just like reaching in there and grabbing a big handful. That was tough. And there was a couple of days, that I did eat more than my rations. One day in particular, I had right after we had a fresh snow, I went out and made a big hike looking for a lion track, trying to find this lion. And just for miles and miles all day long, I was trudging through knee-deep wet snow. And anybody that's ever done that knows that it is absolutely draining.
Miserable.
And you think about that, after you haven't had a decent meal in, 50 days, you can imagine how much that takes out of you. And so a couple of days like that, I probably double what I'd ration. So maybe I had like 6 ounces of jerky that day.
Boy, a real splurge.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like when you do that, I always felt like, it made me feel not great, because it's like I feel like I'm dipping into my reserves that I'm going to need, because I thought this thing was going over 100 days. I was fully prepared to go that long. I actually had my meat rationed out to 90 days. And that's why I had to limit it so much. Luckily I didn't have to do that in the end, but I was ready.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I would think that's so tricky. Like you said, you do something where, and I'm going to circle back to more of this deer story, but you do something that's so physically, the exertion, and like you are, that's a big depletion of your body's resources there. I don't know, like that's tricky because you don't want to keep I feel like eating a little bit more is going to prevent your decline in the long run too. So, I mean, you're kind of caught in a rock and a hard place there.
You have to balance, I felt like there was a lot of times, especially there towards the end, I felt like I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do, especially like they didn't show this on the show, but like that big hike that I did where I was walking through the deep snow, I did that. When I came back from that, I was like, that was the day I realized, like, you know what, I can't afford to do that, because I have only a limited number of calories in food, and I'm not gaining enough to fuel that kind of activity. And so those are definitely things that you think about. Luckily, not long after that, I started actually catching some rabbits. I had some snares out, and I'd shot a couple more grouse with my bow. So I was bringing more food in, but still not enough to fuel the type of activities that I was used to doing. And that was actually one of the most difficult things that I had to face was, because I'm a very active guy, and to be forced with the realization that I can't be active, I can't do that. That was pretty tough for me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Circling back to the deer, like what was the story? I mean, because you shot the deer, fairly early on. What Like, what was the story behind that? Was that, it sounds like you'd found an area that, habitat-wise, like maybe would hold some deer-ish, but you weren't super stoked on it. How did that go down? I mean, how did you find this buck?
Sheer luck. It was tough because it was a tough area. There just weren't very many deer. The whole area, I mean, nobody was seeing any game. I've talked to people. It's hard to tell what exactly is going on out there by watching the show, because the editors, you give them thousands of hours of footage.
Yeah.
And so, you can imagine boiling down thousands of hours into just whatever it is over the entire season, maybe half an hour or 40 minutes of airtime. So they pull out the stuff that they need to tell the story. But so after probably, I don't know, 15 days of being out there, I finally found some fresh deer sign. And it was fresh, like they had been there that morning. And that was the first deer sign I'd seen, like the first fresh deer sign that I'd seen the whole time I was there. And so that got me like saying, okay, well, at least there's a chance that I could potentially find a deer. And it looked like there wasn't a lot of fresh deer sign. It looked like, from what I could tell, it was 2, maybe 3 deer. And they were in this little localized area, in this little willow kind of wetland area. And I'd actually considered building a tree stand in there, but there were so few deer that, one, I thought that being around that area, just, trying to build a tree stand, I thought that might run them out. And then the other thing is there was so few deer that I thought, maybe there's another area out there that's a little bit better, where I might run into a little bit better sign. And so I thought sitting in one area, sitting in a tree stand, would limit
Right.
me. And so I decided to revert to still hunting, which is something that I do a lot. That's kind of my like area of specialty, still hunting with a stick bow. And so by the third week, I think I can't remember exactly when I shot that deer. It was like day 20 or something like that. I think I had caught 4 or 5 fish, had those smoked, and so I had enough fish where I felt like I could gamble a couple of days, on this low odds deer hunt. And so I took my bow everywhere that I went. I mean, everywhere I went. If I was going fishing, if I was going mushroom picking, I always had my bow with me, because you guys know, I mean, that your opportunity could come up at any time.
Yeah.
And so I went out fishing that morning, didn't catch anything, and grabbed my bow, grabbed one camera, and started up into the woods where I had seen that deer sign. Found some fresh deer sign from that morning, found a set of tracks, and cut those tracks and started tracking. And I'd actually bumped a deer. I bumped a single deer, and it was a doe, which per hunting the local regulations was off limits. So I had to let that one go. And probably an hour later, I'm slipping through the lodgepole there, and this red squirrel runs up a tree 10 feet from me, starts chattering, churring at me. You know how they do, barking at you. So I squatted down, just like watched the squirrel for a little bit, let the woods calm down, and then stood up and took about 2 more steps. And this buck jumps up out of its bed and bounds off like 40 yards, which for me with my bow is too far, for a deer. And when I saw him, I just stopped, stood stone still. I had the wind in my favor, and he didn't know what I was. And thank God it was a young buck, which is about the most, that was the perfect animal. If it had been an old doe or a mature buck, I probably never would have gotten away with this. But stood stone still, you know how they do, they'll look at you, they stomp, they turn around in circles, they can't quite figure it out. I had the wind in my favor, and I stood there until he put his head down. I was watching his body language, and he twitched an ear back, and I was like, okay, like he's starting to calm down now.
Mm-hmm.
He dropped his head to feed. When he did that, I dropped down to my knees and knocked an arrow. He dropped his head down to feed a little bit more. I grunted at him. He threw his head back up, looked at me, and started feeding his way towards me. So from 40 yards, yeah. So from 40 yards, he starts browsing and feeding his way through the brush until he gets to 25 yards. Now I'm in a lodgepole stand where there's not a lot of cover. I'm in the wide open, the sun's shining on me. I have no cover. And there's one group of lodgepole pines between me and him. And he stopped 25 yards away with his head perfectly behind a lodgepole pine, and his vitals are exposed. And for a deer, 25 yards is not a long shot, but it's, on the edge of what I'd be comfortable shooting at a deer. An elk, I'll shoot that all day. But with so little cover, I was like, you know what? It ain't getting no better than this. I drew back, put that tough head on his brisket, and released that arrow. And it was like, when I saw that arrow sticking out of that buck, I was like, oh my God, what have I done? And gave him some time. I wasn't real sure of the hit, gave him some time, laid down and took a nap. When I
Gosh,
was tough to do, but I've bow hunted for long enough to know that you don't bump them. You don't follow that track right off the bat. You give him time. And tracked him. He was dead in under 10 seconds. I mean, he was done. I actually heard him crash, but still I wasn't 100% positive. I heard him crash and tracked him up. And man, when I saw that deer on the other, like it was around a blind corner, I walked around and saw him laying in the grass, and it was like, I've killed probably close to 30 animals, or maybe more than 30 big game animals with my self bows. And I've never reacted to a kill like that because it was so much stress on me. My fish, the fishing was I had a tough time catching fish. The fish that I had caught, like I was down to my last piece. I mean, you can imagine, like, you're down to your last piece and you don't know where your next meal's coming from. And it's only day 20. And to have all of that stress just totally taken off the shoulders, I've never experienced anything like that. And I probably never will again. I mean, it was absolutely amazing.
Yeah. And you brought up earlier too, the fact that, I mean, one of the tough things for you guys out there is that you did still have to keep in mind the local regs and hunting seasons and all that. And I'm thinking, I guess you got to realize that you put yourself in that situation voluntarily. So that's probably what, you're not like, you're living sustenance, it's all that, but you're there voluntarily. So that's probably why you have to pay attention to the regs and stuff. But golly,
well, I mean, you guys were so limited in that regard. I mean, going back to the fish, like I think you guys couldn't use live bait. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was no bait, barbless hook.
Yeah, I mean, you got essentially selective fish regulations there. The place is loaded with grizzlies, but you couldn't shoot them.
Can't shoot one of those.
Which apparently was the most, at least from watching from the outside in, that was the most plentiful big game around, which I don't know what those things were living on.
Yeah, there was that's no joke. I mean, there were grizzlies everywhere. I could have killed one on multiple occasions. I mean, that one I had one kind of bluff charge me, and he was, I mean, I wouldn't have shot that bear with a bow. The last thing I want to do is shoot a grizzly with a bow when I don't have a backup, or when he's like looking at me. But there was times when I could have killed one that didn't know I was there. I could have done that. But no, they were off limits. And it was tough regs. But that's part of it. And that's one of the things that you have to accept. Otherwise you're going to beat yourself up about it, while you're out there and just be hating life. But you got to go in with the mindset that this is the way it is, and I just got to make it work.
Yeah.
Yep. With that deer, you built a smoker, which was like amazing. I mean, I guess kind of back with the fishing rod that you built. I mean, is that something that you practiced beforehand too? Was that building something like that to preserve, I guess, larger quantities of meat?
No, I didn't. I didn't practice that. I mean, I've done that type of stuff before. I've built log cabin type, small log cabins, and that's basically what I did for that smoker. Is just built a miniature log cabin. I could have gotten away with building just a rack type smoker and like enclosing that with some boughs. But with so many bears around, I didn't want, there was a 3-day period when all of my meat was on the ground in that smoker. And it's like a bear could have come in and got that and just camped on that. And there would have been nothing that I could have done about it. And so, the reason that I put so much effort into that smoker is because I wanted something to at least, slow them down. I knew that if a bear wanted it, they could have torn into that, but I built it solid enough that it would at least have slowed them down and given me time to assess the situation and figure out what potentially I could have done about it. At that point, I was right or wrong, wise or not, I was ready to do hand-to-hand combat with a grizzly to protect that meat.
Boy, a starved out dude and a grizzly, man, that would be a fight.
Yes, very much. The mental struggle, like you've got your wife Liz, you've got your 2 young boys. I know that they're your world and vice versa. What was that like? And I guess I don't know. It's like on one hand, I would think it makes you all you want to do is be with them, but then did they kind of give you the strength at the same time to forge ahead?
Yeah, they did. And that, being away from them in the long run actually ended up being one of my biggest challenges to overcome. I've spent, like I said before, I spent a lot of time in the backcountry. I spent a lot of time away from them, but never this much in total isolation. I mean, there was no contact at all. I had no idea what was going on here at the house. And Liz actually, she went through some pretty trying times, here by herself, which I'll probably end up talking about later. But anyway, yeah, they did. They did give me strength. One of the reasons that I went out there was to provide a good example for my boys. I wanted, especially Coy, my oldest one, I wanted to show him that, give an example of how to overcome the adversity that we face. And one of the things that they included in the last episode, and I'm really glad that they did, is, there is nothing in life that is actually worth achieving that you don't have, that nothing's going to come easy that's worth achieving. To achieve anything worthwhile, you have to overcome massive difficulty and obstacles. And I wanted to show him that even though things don't always work out the way that you want them to, or the way that you envision, that if you keep after it, just one foot in front of the other, that you can overcome those things. So that was for me, that was a big part of what kept me going in that, especially in those later days. Is, I was literally starving. I mean, I lost a lot of weight out there. The days were very short. It was getting dark at 4 o'clock and not getting light till 8 or 9 even. It was tough.
That's brutal.
That's one heck of a commitment to teach your boys an important life lesson.
Yeah. Having gotten to meet your boys, though, when we were doing the self-bow build pod venture that we did.
Yep.
I'm sure they probably thought it was all really cool when they finally got to watch it, seeing all that stuff that you're making out there in the middle of nowhere. And I mean, they seem like you know, however old they are. I know they're not that old. They're probably already like trying all that stuff themselves now, aren't they?
Yeah, we've done a couple of videos where we've like recreated stuff, you know, for the YouTube channel where I've recreated stuff from the show, and they helped me rebuild my shelter from out there, and done some other carving type projects. So yeah, it's been fun watching the show with them, letting them see what some of the stuff that I did out there.
Yeah.
Are they pretty proud of Dad?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. You're out there, and your world is like, I don't know, like when I look at it, it's like your world is so small and yet so big at the same time. Like you're in this vast wilderness, but like your personal world is so small, and what you have to do or accomplish on a daily basis is really simple, right? Like you had to, you know, food, water, shelter, but the consequences for not being able to get those things or make those things happen are giant. So was that like refreshing in a way, though, to have your life kind of boiled down to that level of simplicity?
Yeah, I mean, it you're basically responsible for yourself and providing for yourself, and that's it. That's your entire world is providing for yourself from what the land can provide, and that's a very simple yet very complex thing. It's not an easy thing. I mean, the land doesn't care; it's completely indifferent to you, and so it is. You know, and one of the interesting things about that is when your entire responsibility is reduced to that, and you have so much time alone, it gives you the opportunity to be introspective like you very rarely get. You know, people today don't ever get that. You know, we're constantly distracted by social media or television or other people. And so the time where you just get to, you know, focus on looking inward, you know, you get to question things like why you live your life the way that you live it, you know, why you do things the way you do. And that's a powerful thing that very few people get to experience today.
Yeah. I mean, there's really no other way to do it than to intentionally or unintentionally, I guess, put yourself in a situation like that, which is very rare.
What's do you have a new happy medium that you've achieved now in life, back in normalcy, so to speak, where I'd have to assume doing what you were doing, in fact, I'm pretty darn certain you wouldn't want to live like that forever. And so that's where, you know, sometimes you look at things and you're like, well, yeah, maybe we have advanced a little bit as a society, but has everything we've done as a modern society been an advancement? Like, do you have now this area that you're at where you're like, well, I kind of like a little bit of this primitiveness, so to speak?
Well, I don't know. I think I did a pretty good job of simplifying our lives before I ever went out there. You know, I've never chased the promotions. I've never chased money. I've just followed my heart and done the things that I felt like I was meant to do. And it's been amazing. You know, that's been an amazing experience. But yeah, I mean, being out there in the woods, you definitely, it's a struggle. You know, the people that think that they want to go and live in the woods like that indefinitely, I think it's a wonderful experience for people to do. I think everyone should go into the wilderness at some point just to do the things that I had talked about before, just be introspective, looking inward. question why you do things the way that you do them, because you might learn things about yourself that you would never realize otherwise. But to live that way long term is that's rough. You know, I like my bed. You know, I like not having to fast for 5 days until I can catch a rabbit. You know, those things are they're nice.
Indeed they are.
I bet that is nice.
Having more than 10 things.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying like, you know, I having all this stuff.
You're all about the stuff, Jim.
Come on, don't make me out to be this material guy and a material. No, but you know, it's most of us have 10 things that we usually use a lot, but it's nice if you're like, well, I need an 11th today.
Yeah.
Nobody's telling me I can't.
I mean, so speaking of material things, though, which you had very few of, some you came with, and some you worked really hard to get. Like you built your shelter out there, you built your cabin. Tons of time and effort went into building that, which it really was an amazing shelter, and you spent so much time in that shelter, and it really was so pivotal to you being able to survive out there, to last out there, to have that place of shelter to go when the weather got bad. Was that, were you like glad to see it go, or was there, like, did you feel like you were kind of giving up a very important place, or a place that at least had been very important to you for a really long time?
You mean when it come time to go home?
Yeah. Was that like
no, it was
a bizarre thing?
No, man, I was ready. I was ready to go, and I had been ready for a long time. You know, there was one other thing that I'd said out there that they used on the show was, you know, when I first went out there, I did it for me. You know, I did it just because these are the things that I've been doing my whole life, and I wanted to put those things to the test. I wanted to see if I could go out there and do it. But at some point I got over that, and I would have gone home. You know, I'd have gone home, you know, right then. But I made the commitment when I went out there I was just not going to quit. You know, they would have had to, I was either going to win it or they were going to have to pull me out, you know, because I'd lost too much weight or for medical reasons. But, you know, when it did come time to go, you know, I spent, like you said, I spent a lot of time in that shelter, but no, I had no sentimental attachments to that at all, or that place. I was just ready to get back home and see my wife and kids.
Man, I believe it. What, you saw so many cool things out there. You know, I mean, it really was as tough as I'm sure it was, like it was beautiful, and you saw some cool things. What do you think was like the coolest thing that you saw out there? Like anything like really stand out?
There was a lot of cool things, man, and a lot of stuff that didn't make the show. You know, having the bear run up to me was, you know, that's something you never forget. And I just thought it was like the coolest thing I've ever seen. Yeah. I wasn't, and it surprised me, you know, when that bear came up to me, I never got the shakes. It wasn't a scary thing for me. And I think primarily because his body language to me, you know, I've spent my life around big animals. I grew up, my dad raised bison. I've hunted my whole life. I've been around bears. I've been around, like I said, big animals my whole life. And so reading animals' body language is, you know, it's something that comes natural to me. And when he was coming to me, what it reminded me of was a flushing dog, you know, like that's going in on a pheasant. He didn't know what I was. He was coming to me out of curiosity. He didn't, his body language didn't say aggression to me. And so I just thought it was cool. Seeing the mountain lion come up behind me, I mean, that's once in a lifetime thing. I mean, I've seen mountain lions before, but they've always been in trees above dogs. Like I've never seen a mountain lion that close in the woods, just doing his thing. One of the coolest things, though, was right at the end. So in this last episode, they show that I had a fisher that was coming into camp, and they like the fisher. They made it look like I was trying to run him off, and I wasn't really. I enjoyed having him around camp. By that time, I was catching a few rabbits and had some grouse, and so I would leave my bones and stuff right outside the camp door, and he'd come every night for probably the last 10 days or something. He'd come back every single night, and I really looked forward to him coming and seeing him. And at one point, I left the door to my shelter open and had Bones right by the shelter door, and he came up. He was eating the bones, and I was laying on my bunk, and he was 3 feet from me, 3 feet from my face. And he actually started to come inside the shelter. Like, he had his head inside my door, and I looked down there and I said, "Don't you come in here." And he kind of looked at me, and he backed out, and he went back out into the front of the shelter and kind of poking around. But that was just such a cool experience to have that. I mean, what a fascinating animal, just a very cool animal. And I'd only seen him at night. He would only come back to my shelter at night. No, I take that back. I did see him one time. I was out on my trap line. I saw him one time during the day. I watched him chasing a snowshoe hare through the timber. And that was the first time I ever saw him. But the last day, the day that I went home, the whole crew, the producers and everybody standing around, and they're doing that exit interview type thing, where they told me I was the last one. And the fisher, there's a little ridge behind camp. He came up during the day while everybody's standing there. And it's like he came up on that ridge and stands there and looks at everybody. It's like he's saying goodbye or something. I mean, it was amazing. Like the first time he'd ever come up to camp during the day. But that was definitely one of the coolest things
that was cool.
out there.
Man,
yeah.
that is absolutely amazing and super cool. And like you said, like, I don't know, some interesting, I don't know, not symbolism, but it kind of like, I don't know, man. It seems like there's something to it.
You see any interesting weather phenomena, like non-animal related phenomena up there?
I will actually, Jim. I'm going to go back to one thing that I find curious, though, or interesting. So, I had in here, my first question that I had written down was the coolest thing you saw, and I had scariest moment.
Oh yeah.
And then I had, the bear charge ? And what I like is that both those things were one of Clay's coolest moments. Anyway,
yeah.
What were you going to say, Jim?
Oh yeah, I got charged by a bear. It's awesome. Should have been there. No thanks. But yeah, like how about just non-animal related stuff? You see any like just odd weather phenomena? You see any UFOs? I mean, that's really what actually I'm ultimately getting.
Let's get to the crux of your question there,
just
Jim.
Any stuff that was like unexplainable?
No, I didn't see Bigfoot, didn't see any UFOs. Unfortunately, I was really looking though. I was really looking for Bigfoot. Now, but the weather was crazy on that lake. Like the wind, they showed, I can't remember what episode it was, but they showed one time I was out on the lake shore and like doing like a weather report, and the video from that day does not do that justice. I mean, it was gnarly. Like I could stand up at almost a 45-degree angle into the wind, and the wind would hold me up. And I'm a fairly narrow, especially I was pretty narrow by that time. But the waves were coming and white capping, and the wind was cutting the top of the waves off and picking that mist up, and it was blowing like sideways sheets of like horizontal rain, but not rain. It was coming off, it was picking the lake up and blowing that across the lake. It was awesome.
Jeez.
But one of the cool things that I write about in the book, it was not cool at the time, but like I said, the wind on that place was there was big glaciers up at the head of this big glacial valley, and when the wind came over from over the coast range and hit those glaciers, it would super cool, which would cause all of that air to condense, and the only place that it had to go was down that narrow valley. And so once that wind got into that valley, it was strong, like, I don't know, 50, 60, like hurricane force winds coming up that thing. And I was laying in my shelter one night and heard trees coming down, and you're trying to sleep in the midst of a lodgepole stand, and you can hear trees falling. And that was one of the most nerve-wracking, stressful nights that I had out there, because you're at any minute, you're thinking that a tree could come down. And there was one lodgepole that was leaning. It was probably 100-year-old lodgepole. It was leaning over the top of my shelter. And so I'm thinking about this tree all night long, and actually ended up sleeping like, curled up in a little ball. Cause if, when I was stretched out, that tree was leaning over where my legs would have been. And I was thinking about that thing. That's all I could think about was this tree coming down and breaking both my legs. Luckily, the tree didn't come down, but when I got up the next morning, there was a treetop that was probably 6-inch treetop that had come down and hit the ground within 35 yards of the shelter. So if that had come down into the shelter, that would have been game over. I mean, that's something like that could kill you.
Yeah. That's a bad deal. I mean, they call those things widowmakers for a reason.
Yeah.
Holy windstorms, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
How did you keep track of time? And is it important to keep track of time, or is it better to not think about the time?
I didn't keep track of time because it didn't matter to me. I didn't care what day it was, because in my mind, I was there till I either won or they pulled me out. So
yeah,
it didn't matter.
That makes sense.
I mean, you'd set those, really just 2 milestones or whatever, and that's it. As it got towards the end, you got a lot of days without food, but a little bit of a stint there. When you trap those rabbits, how did you feel? Well, maybe mentally when you caught those things. That's got to be just like the deer or the trout. I mean, that's got to be just an incredible moment. And then, so maybe talk a little bit about that. But then, how did you feel after eating them? Like physically with your body, could you just feel that strength, a rejuvenation?
Yeah. So I started. There weren't very many rabbits around, and so I started seeing some hair signs probably right around the first part of November, and so I started setting some snares. And I'd used all my snare wire to build my shack and to build the smoker. And so I had to scavenge wire out of the smoker to be able to set snares with. Cause when I first got there, I wasn't seeing any signs. So I hadn't planned on setting any snares. I finally started seeing a little bit of sign and set out, probably a dozen, maybe 15 snares to start with. And I just added to those, as time went on. But I caught that first one, and it was, not nearly on the level that the deer was, but definitely very much appreciated at that time, because I had rationed my deer out so slimly that I was still just dropping weight, in more than a sustainable rate.
Okay.
So I started catching those rabbits, and at that time, when I first started catching rabbits, I was like, okay, that's another day. That's another day I can stay here. Another day I can stay here. But after catching a couple of them, they had warned me about my weight. They said, we're concerned about your weight. And once they did that, I stopped looking at rabbit and grouse as an extra days and just started eating those in addition to what my rations already were. And so towards the end, I actually gained a little bit of weight back. I'd gotten down very, very thin. I think I was down to 140 pounds and came out at 142. And so I lost 40 pounds while I was out there. I went in at 180, which is, I gained a lot of weight to go in. But I haven't weighed 140 pounds since I was probably a freshman in high school. And I lost a lot of muscle, while I was out there. All my body fat. I was probably, I had no body fat at all. I was probably 4.5%, 5% body fat. I looked like an ultra marathon runner when I came out. But when I would catch those rabbits and like the deer shanks and all that stuff, like, I would cook. I hate they didn't show it, but I actually did a cooking show. Like I put together a cooking show.
Oh man.
So I'd cook what I call chilko stew. So I'd have either some kind of deer, I kept the shanks and the all that type of stuff, the neck in whole pieces. But for like the rabbit, I would take, so every evening there was a bunch of what they call a plant called, what is it? Labrador tea. It's like a little evergreen shrub, makes great tea. So every evening after dinner, I would go fill my pot up. I'd put some of this Labrador tea on, put that on the fire and just let that simmer as the fire died down. Next morning, I would get up, I'd heat that back up and drink like 2 quarts of that, like every single morning. And then I would go back down to the lake shore. Fire's still going. I'd put some more water in my pot and I'd put whatever meat that I was going to have that day. So let's say it was a rabbit. I'd put that in that pot, about 2 inches of water, and I had a 12-inch, I think it was a 12-inch, 2-quart Dutch oven. Put that back on the fire, let that meat simmer while I was out checking my trap line or doing whatever. So that would simmer for a couple of hours. I'd let the fire die down. I'd build the fire back about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So the meat had already simmered for, hours. I would throw in a bunch of cranberries, a bunch of pine mushrooms. And then I had for my deer, I had rendered down a bunch of fat, all the internal fat, the fat from his rump. And so I had probably 2 quarts of deer fat, and I would just break off a chunk of that deer tallow, throw that in there and let that simmer, until 5, 6 o'clock when I would have dinner. So that whole pot would just simmer for like 7, 8 hours, and it would fall off the bone. I mean, it was thick enough. It was freaking amazing. I mean, the cranberries, the tartness of the cranberries, and the hardiness of that meat and any kind of marrow that was in the bones. It was really, really good.
It sounds good.
It was.
Would you?
It was something that I would. Yeah, I would. It was something that I would eat. I'd cook it. High bush cranberries. That's the ticket, because I actually tried to cook it here with like regular cranberries, and it's not the same. Like you got to have those high bush cranberries.
That's interesting.
It does sound like you're making me hungry. Just like, oh yeah, that sounds. It's so primitive, and yet it sounds so good. But then I also wonder, like, if you did have maybe that's a bad example because it just actually sounds good. But like some things, when you're at that level of hunger or even starvation, like if you had that now, like after being back, if you'd be like, oh man, that is terrible. But but it's just so good when you're in like that kind of moment or condition.
You mentioned the Dutch oven or some sort of like a pot or something like that, and we talked about the stick bow and a few other items. We mentioned this whole 10-item thing. If you went back and looked at it, the 10 items you brought, 1, what were they? And then 2, would you switch that up at all, knowing what you know now, having been through what you've been through?
So first of all, no, I wouldn't switch anything. I was very happy with everything that I took.
Sweet.
And everything that I took was, there were several items that I really debated on. I really thought hard about not taking a ferro rod, because I'm very confident in my ability to start a friction fire, even in that environment, a cold, wet environment. I'm very comfortable with that. And even after being out there for so long, I feel like I could have done that. And swapped out that ferro rod for some other item. but even though I could have done that, I'm still glad that I took it, because, if I'd not taken it, I would have had to start friction fire, and I would have either had to start a friction fire every day, which is a fair bit of effort, or I would have had to keep a coal going all the time, which means processing a lot of firewood. So either way, you've got a pretty substantial caloric cost.
Yeah.
And so for me, the ferro rod was just like a calorie savings thing.
Yeah.
So I always forget something. So let's see, what did I take? I took my sleeping bag, ferro rod, pot, bow and arrow. Keep track of this because I'm not going to remember all 10 of them. So that's 4. I took my Leatherman, which was indispensable.
Yeah.
I took an axe, the biggest silky saw that they would allow me to take, which was the Katana Boy 650. It's a freaking like a chainsaw. So that's 7. Paracord, which I used the inner cores of that for making my. I made a gill net out of that, and then also made a landing net. Trap wire. I'm missing the last one. It seems like 10 items would be easy to remember, but I can't.
You're close, though. I think that we either covered them or we missed maybe just one. I'm trying to think. I watched the whole darn thing. Maybe it'll come to us.
Pot?
I think I mentioned that, but I took a pot. That was, I wanted to. I could have. That's another thing that you could have gotten away without. But in my mind, like, a pot is so. I mean, come on.
Very multi-use.
It's multi-use. I just drank straight out of the lake. I didn't boil water or anything. I mean, it's such a pristine area. I mean, the glaciers are right there. You're like drinking glacial milk. So I didn't feel like I needed to boil water. But when you're on such reduced caloric intake, you need to get every bit of nutrients out of whatever you're cooking. And the best way to do that is just what I was talking about: a low, slow, long braising. Because like when I would cook a rabbit for 8 hours, really slow like that, it would suck every bit of nutrients out of those bones. I mean, those bones were like bleach white when I pulled them out of there.
Oh, yeah.
And same with the deer. Like, I would cook those, if I had a shank or something like that, all of that bone marrow would just melt. All of that connective tissue would just absolutely melt and turn into this gravy. And so, I mean, it tasted good. I mean, the pine mushrooms, I found a bunch of pine mushrooms. I probably take 40 pounds of pine mushrooms while I was out there. And those things are awesome. But when you combine that and the cranberries and the fat from the deer, I mean, it was so good.
And low and slow, nothing sizzling, spattering all over the place. And you're also not getting any degradation of anything that you got in there. Because I know, certain fats or things will degrade with high heat, so you're just keeping everything in there. You're just sort of changing its form a little bit.
Yeah,
soaking everything out of it. I got it. I'll full disclosure, moment of honesty, Clay. I got him. I was watching the finale today. Like, I got emotional, right? But I can't even imagine, like, what was it like for you in that moment when they're like, Clay, you're the last one. It's over.
At first you can see it on my face. Like, when they told me, I was in disbelief. It didn't make sense to me what they were saying, because it's interesting. It was something that Teresa had said on that same episode, that last episode, was when they come out, especially that late, when they come out, and you don't expect them to come out. It's like, you can't help but to think, maybe today is the day. Maybe today is the day that they come to tell me that I'm the last one here. But at the same time, it's like, you can't, if you let yourself hope that that's the last day and that's going to be it, and it's not, that can be crushing. And if you watch season 6, I think it was season 6 when Barry did that. He was convinced that his wife was coming and he was the last one and he had won. And then they walked away, and it was like, man, that just rips your heart out.
I could see that being a crushing blow.
Yes, it could be. And so I had built up this mental block, like I had guarded myself against hoping for anything like that for so long that when they finally said I was going home, it just like didn't register. It was like, I don't know what I'm hearing. And it didn't register until they said, you're the last one, you've outlasted everyone. And when they said that, it was like, it was emotional because that meant I was going home. I mean, that's something I've thought about every single day for the last 74 days.
What was that sat phone call like, getting to hear your family's voice?
Getting to hear my wife's voice, for the first time in 74 days was amazing. I wish that she could have come up there, but the COVID, nobody was allowed to come into Canada at that time. And so it just wasn't possible, but, hearing her voice was absolutely amazing. And then we talked we had a little bit of a recovery period after I came out, before I was able to go home. And we talked every single day, like for hours a day. And then finally getting home and getting to see them, getting to hug my boys for the first time and, that long, getting to kiss Liz, it was awesome. Being away from them for that long gives you an appreciation that it's hard to get without going through something like that.
Totally.
I was actually just before getting on this, I was actually putting together some video. I had a GoPro with me, and then Liz had a GoPro there. Like when we came together for that first time, it's pretty emotional. So I'm trying to put that together for a video.
That's awesome.
Great. Well, looks like I got another. Got to suck them back one more time when I watch. I'm
not crying. You're crying.
Yeah.
What was on a less serious note?
Yeah.
What was the first meal you ate when you got back home? Like home.
I had that same question.
Liz asked me that. She said, "What did I cook the first meal you got home?" And I don't remember it. I do remember the first meal that I had, like when I got on the airplane and I landed in Vancouver. I had a cold IPA and a double-decker cheeseburger and a piece of cheesecake.
Yeah.
I actually had 2 beers.
Yeah, and at 140 pounds and after having just eaten almost nothing for 74 days, were you just absolutely wasted?
I didn't have a very far walk to my room, so I was good.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, just an absolute fat and calorie bomb and just pure enjoyment there.
And did your body take it?
Yeah.
Like how did
Yeah. So they don't just like kick you back out. They keep you there for a little while. They make sure that they have a refeeding program, so they make sure that you're in good, healthy conditions before they send you home.
Not just like, hey, here, eat everything, and then like now all of a sudden you're just like basically bulimic because you can't hold anything down.
I know. Yeah. I know from just some of my experiences like hunting or even just, the handful of backcountry trips that I've done where you definitely have a lot more resources than you have, but you do have like a finite amount of resources. And I always find it like somewhat just interesting kind of when you're plucked out of that environment and you're back in your daily life and then you go to a grocery store. Like what was it like being in a grocery store for the first time? Was that like sensory overload, or was even the modern world like was there an element of sensory overload where all of a sudden you're just like back in the busy and like the colors and just like the food of it, like the sheer quantity of food that's just like available at your fingertips? Was that like an interesting transition or observation for you at all?
Not as much as it would be, or you would think it would be. I mean, it felt normal to me. I try to avoid going to town. I mean, we live out in the middle of nowhere here in Idaho, and the grocery store is an hour away, and Liz is usually one that does all that stuff. So I do my best to not go to town. And so I was probably back home a month before I ever even, went anywhere.
Yeah.
It was different though. Like when I first came out, like that first night, out of the woods, back in the lodge where they have us, do this, reorientation or whatever period you got to go through before you go home. Like that whole first night, I don't think I slept one wink. I didn't sleep at all.
Really?
That night, not a wink. It was just, I don't know, man. I'd been on that lake for so long, and it's like on the lake you have it's constant, natural noise. You have the wind, you have the waves, you have the ambience of the lake, and then to be like removed from that and put into a box where you've got an air conditioner running or whatever it was, a heater at that time of year. You can hear people talking. But then, on top of that, there's all of these things going through your head. And it's like, I don't know, there's a term for it where there's just flashes of stuff, just, rapid fire in your head. And there was no way that I could sleep. And it wasn't until the next night. And I only think I slept very good the next night. I think it probably took me about 3 days to get reacquainted to actually like sleeping in a bed and hearing unnatural noises.
Weird.
Yeah. I mean,
I wouldn't have expected that. I'd expected to just show up and be like, oh, this is great. Like, out.
I'm out. Yeah.
Huh.
No, it was really strange. I mean, I spent, when I first came out, I got back to the lodge and they handed me a blank journal and a pen. And I went through 3 pens while I was there, wrote like 70 something pages, which formed the foundation for the book that is now at the editors. But there were so many times out there that I probably would have given $5,000 for a 10-cent Bic pen and a spiral bound notebook, just to be able to record my thoughts. But they wanted us to talk to the camera instead of writing. So we couldn't have any of that stuff. But yeah, that's what I did the whole time I was, back at the lodge. I just wrote. I talked to Liz on the phone and I wrote,
Yeah, man, it definitely seems like, just like, all that stuff. And then I keep asking you about like, oh, so what was it like when you got back to civilization? You're like, well, I know this about you and I know you, and you're just not really much one for civilization. So you really were. I mean, you'd built
Clay,
and prepared yourself.
You're not very civilized, Clay. I think that's what Mark's trying to say.
That is not what I was trying to say.
Well,
but
it sounded an awful lot like
you've been training your whole life for this.
Yes.
That's all right. I take that as a compliment.
Do you have any new perspectives on life that you take with you after the experience?
That they had mentioned it in the show. They had put this in the show, but stoicism's been a big part of my life for, I don't know, 5-6 years or so. And there was a couple of like stoic principles that I learned deeply, out there. A lot of times with stuff like that, you kind of know that stuff on the surface, but it's not driven into you and integrated into the person that you are until you go through some sort of challenge or some sort of adversity like that. And so one of the things that really became a part of me out there, one of those principles, is that any kind of suffering that we experience, it's of our own making, and it's of our own making simply because of the way that we view things. I went through some, I got depressed while I was out there when the days started getting short. I had very little to eat. So I was, you had this darkness, you had slow starvation, you had isolation from family. And, there was a time when I got very down And it was simply due to the fact that I was viewing my time there as something that I had to suffer through instead of viewing it as an opportunity. And I eventually got through that. And part of the thing that got me through that was thinking of my boys. I thought they didn't really show this a lot, but I thought of my boys watching that and seeing that on television. Like, I'm sitting here in my shelter moping around and being depressed and complaining about my situation, and that's not what I want them to see. And so the thought of them watching that brought me out of that, and it completely changed my perspective. I no longer saw the time that I had there as something that I had to suffer through, but I saw it as an opportunity to show them how to overcome adversity. I saw it as an opportunity to make them Christmas gifts and to finish all these things and to experience this once in a lifetime thing as best I could. And so when I had that change of perspective, and that's all it was, nothing changed about my situation. I just changed my perspective. It's like all of my suffering that I'd been going through, all of that went away. I mean, just like that. And so that's one of those things that was just like driven into my bones. Another thing that I really realized is that all things are just as they should be, no matter what happens, and an example that I have to illustrate that is like my fishing and my deer. Like when I was fishing, the fishing was very, very difficult. I had caught just enough fish, like I said earlier. I caught just enough fish to get me ahead for maybe a couple of days until I had that fish stocked up, and I felt like, okay, now I can gamble this on these couple of days on going and trying to find a deer. At the time, I was like, man, this really sucks. The fishing sucks. This is terrible. But if the fishing had been better, I may never have gone deer hunting. And so it's like a lot of times things happen and we judge them as being bad, but it's not until later that time gives that thing context that we can really judge it accurately. And so, I mean, things happen, just accept things. If we accept things the way they are, the things that happen, I mean, you never know what's going to transpire down the road. So just, live in the moment, accept things the way they are and move forward.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the importance of my family. I mean, just like my family is always around, especially Liz. I mean, my wife, we've been together since we were 17 years old. She's always been there. And when someone or something is always there, you can take them for granted. And being away, having that thing not there gives you that perspective. It makes you realize how much those things mean to you. And so, those three things were the big takeaways. I ended up winning the big, I won the thing. I walked away with $500,000, but that's not, those three lessons to me are more valuable than anything else that I could have walked away from.
Yeah.
From that experience with.
For sure. I mean, man, that's definitely what you just said is, hopefully a lot of people listen to this podcast and listen to that, because definitely a lot of really, really sound words of wisdom there. And then also along with that, the different folks who, put themselves out there for this experience, everybody went into it, not everybody, but people went into it with different motivations, I guess, right? None of them wrong. But, the money factor throughout never really seemed to be your motivation. So I think, I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. So,
yeah.
Jim, any other questions from you?
Yeah, I just have one more, which is, I mean, you're the kind of guy that likes to go out in the wilderness a lot, do cool hunts and stuff like that. I'm assuming you still want to do that. Would you ever go back to that place, or are you kind of like, no, screw that? Or was it cool enough that you're like, oh yeah, hey, I'd go back, I'd take the boys, or you know?
I wouldn't want to go back there and have to scrape a living out of that landscape.
Yeah.
But like going back, you know, if that place, and it's only about 8 hours from us to drive there. You know, when the borders open up, I would love to take Liz and the boys back, charter a boat, go back to where we were, and just show them around the place. That would be awesome. We may end up doing that actually.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
That's awesome. That's
Sweet.
awesome.
Yeah.
I've only got one more question, Clay, but any thoughts that you've had along the way, or something that we didn't ask that you thought was cool or important or anything like that?
I mean, I think we covered it all. It was a once in a lifetime experience. It was a transformative experience. It was a profound experience, and it's something that, you know, very few people ever are going to get to do something like that.
Mm.
But even if you can't do something like that, like I said before, I think just unplugging for a little while. I mean, that would do so many people so much good. It's just unplug for a week, go into the wilderness by yourself, and just be there. And I think you might learn something. And like I said, that introspection is something that we rarely get, but it's a very powerful thing. And I think a lot of people could benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Man, what, and you may have covered this in some of your other answers, but coming out of this experience, like, what are you most proud of? Like, what would you say, man, this is the thing that I'm just like most proud of coming out of this thing?
I don't know. I mean, I was able to draw on so many experiences and that I've had throughout my life, and skills that I've developed throughout my life. I mean, if I hadn't have had the upbringing, if I hadn't have had the experience that I've been fortunate enough to have throughout my life, I don't know that I could have done that. But probably the thing that I'm most proud of is, and it's unfortunate they didn't show a lot of it in the show, but was coming through that period of depression that I went through, coming out the other side and having those lessons, those stoic lessons forced into the core of who I am. You know, that's the most valuable thing. It's probably the thing that I'm most proud of. And it's hard to convey that to people, you know, because people don't understand, you know, most people have never been through any kind of trying challenge on that type of scale. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think that would have to be it.
Awesome. For sure.
Oh, that's a good answer.
Yeah, real good one. Well, Clay, thank you so much for, mm-hmm. I mean, for sharing these experiences on the show. Thanks for visiting with us about the experience and giving us a really, really awesome kind of, you know, behind the scenes look at everything that you went through and the adversity that you faced and lessons learned, and so much substance there. So thank you for that. Thanks for being you, and genuinely appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to when you guys can come down to Florida and chase some hogs with those stick boats.
We're ready. So yeah, I mean, I will point out, so jumping back into content related things, and Jim, you touched on it earlier, but we had went down to visit Clay at his Florida ranch earlier. We made those bows with him.
Yep.
And so we might be going back down to go chase some hogs, like Clay just
with
said.
Those bows,
with those bows. And if you want to check out that content,
you can find all of that on anywhere that you normally listen to podcasts or on YouTube. It's called the Clay Hayes Self Bow Series, something along those lines. So it was a pod venture that we did. And yeah.
And I think you'll be able to see some of that on Clay's website, possibly sometime down the road in the future, which you're probably already conditioned to view all the great content there, so you can see some great recaps of Clay's experience on Alone. You can access all the other great videos that he's got on, building self bows and just related.
And building all the crazy stuff that he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the related bushcraft stuff. So check it out.
Do that. Also, check out Alone if you haven't actually seen it yet. So in that case, you don't know what we're talking about. You kind of know the ending, though. So it's still worth watching. I can confirm. It is still worth watching despite knowing the end and having everybody talking about it. So do that. And, yeah, we'll see everybody on the next one.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Clay.
Bye. There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.